Okay.
Yay!
All right. All right.
Okay.
I'm signing off to go fix the other thing. Maybe.
Thank you, Jerry.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. And Pam,
Yes.
Pam, were you able to forward that thing for me? Because I couldn't do it to the friend. Never mind. She can see the recording. Okay.
Right.
I'm going to abbreviate the introduction. This is the League of Women Voters Lunch with the League. Everyone knows that we're a nonpartisan political organization and we never support candidates or political parties. And we have an education wing, an education part and an advocacy part after we've studied things, so that the comments of the people who speak are not necessarily those of the League. We'll be home here from noon until probably a little after 1, since we started late. Our speakers today are Nimbi Cushing, Dr. Monica Tetzlaff, GlendaRae Hernandez, and all are members of the South Bend Reparation Working Group. Just very briefly, Nimbi was raised by relatives and participated in sharecropping while living in Tennessee with her grandparents. She's a veteran of the Air Force. She's been a flight attendant for many years and is also active in many organizations and her church. Dr. Monica Tetzlaff is an associate professor of history at IU South Bend. She also teaches African American history, women's history, and the history of the environmental movement. She is a daughter of immigrants from Germany and Hungary. GlendaRae Hernandez is a longtime member of the League, was our treasurer for many, many years. And the title of the talk for today is The Case for Reparations. And this is from the South Bend Reparation Working Group. So Nimbi, would you go ahead and start?
Yes, thank you so much. I am relieved to see that I'm not the only one that had a glitch or two. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. A special thanks to my dear friends and 1 or 2 family members from out of state, especially my friends out in California. Since this is Lunch with the League, I hope you will feel free to enjoy yours during our time together. In addition, this is a safe place for you to ask questions that perhaps you have been hesitant to ask elsewhere. Toward that end, there are several South Bend Reparation Working Group members in the room, in addition to those of us on panel today. The position of the South Bend Reparation Working Group is that we are standing on sacred ground made possible by the genocide and banishment of the indigenous people of this area who came before us. In our conversations about reparations for descendants of slavery, we also acknowledge those who were the first victims of white supremacy and aggression against people of color. Reparations is a touchy subject for many. Hopefully, we will end this session today with a little better understanding of the topic, as well as of each other's perspectives. So why are we even having these conversations about reparations at this time in our nation's history? In the June 2014 issue of The Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates opened his essay titled The Case for Reparations with these words: 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, 35 years of racist housing policy. Until we reckon with our compounding moral debts, America will never be whole. End of quote. Such words are painful to hear, but the truth is not always pretty or easy. However, to knowingly deny such truths is nothing short of sabotaging a critical chapter from the history of these United States. Representative John Conyers, a Democrat from Michigan, first introduced in the House of Representatives, H.R. 40 in 1989. Basically, the bill, if passed, would charge a commission to examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies and the United States from 1619 to the present and recommend appropriate remedies. For the next 39 years until his retirement, Congressman Conyers reintroduced that bill at each new House of Representatives session. He died in 2019. That same year, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, a Democrat of Texas, reintroduced the bill. It's named for the 40 acres and a mule promise, thus H.R. 40. I want to emphasize this point, that the bill, should it ever pass, would only establish a commission to explore the idea of reparations becoming a reality. The bill would then require passage in the House, the Senate, and approval by the President before becoming law. Then what? It stands to reason that if H.R. 40, a bill to designate a body of legislators to discuss the whys or why not on the question of reparations, if such a bill has not passed in 39 years, how much longer might it take to form the commission? How many years of deliberations will they go through before devising a plan? The abominable lag in justice, already too long delayed, is but one indication that the government of the United States has no interest and sees no reason to even consider having such a potentially pivotal discussion. What would be their inspiration for doing so? Opinions about reparations range from the sublime to the radical, from Joe Johnson on the street corner to Presidents Obama, Trump, and Biden in the White House. President Obama had 2 terms in office, and one might think that during his tenure, reparations for descendants of slaves might have been a priority, but such was not the case. The reasons are captured in a quote by Obama, who said, "So, if you ask me theoretically, are reparations justified? The answer is yes. There's not much question that the wealth of this country, the power of this country, was built in significant part, not exclusively, maybe not even a majority of it, but a large portion of it was built on the backs of slaves. What I saw during my presidency was the politics of white resistance and resentment, the talk of welfare queens and the talk of the undeserving poor, and the backlash against affirmative action. All that made the prospect of actually proposing any kind of coherent, meaningful reparations program not only a non-starter, but potentially counterproductive." End of quote. President Trump said, "The concept of the federal government giving reparations to the descendants of slaves is unusual and interesting, but I don't see it happening." And the current president, Joe Biden, says that he supports a study of reparations, but believes that the task in front of us is to root out the systemic racism where it exists right now. According to Gallup polls, the majority of Americans are not in favor of reparations. Of course, when those numbers are compared by race, it is clear that 70% of African Americans are in favor of reparations in some form. If we look back at our history, there are some undeniable truths, including the fact that Thomas Jefferson was a lifelong slaveholder, yet in 1776, he wrote and signed the Declaration of Independence. We can all recite the key words of the preamble to that document, which says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, the founding fathers did not seek to honor those infamous words. They were composed by and for the ruling class, made up entirely of white men. Slaves were not treated as human beings except when it was to the advantage of those who owned them. Thus, in 1787, delegates from both the North and the South devised a plan known as the 3/5 Compromise. The agreement was that each slave would be counted as 3/5 a person for the purpose of taxation and representation. That law remained until the passage of the 14th Amendment, nearly 100 years later. So why are we having the conversation on reparations now? We're having it because those who were in power at the time when slaves were freed, those lawmakers, most of whom owned slaves, chose to ignore their promise. In January of 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, abolishing slavery and setting 4 million people free. General William Sherman met with 20 Black ministers in his Savannah, Georgia headquarters. The question of the hour was, how would newly freed Black people survive economically after more than 200 years of bondage and unpaid labor? A few days after, Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15, which would confiscate Confederate land. He later ordered that 40 acres and a mule be given to thousands of Blacks. 4 months later, after President Lincoln was assassinated, the order was rescinded and the land given back to the Confederates. Andrew Johnson of Tennessee was the 17th president and did not favor Emancipation Proclamation. By the end of 1865, Mississippi enacted the first Black codes. South Carolina soon followed. Black codes were designed to relegate newly freed slaves back to the position of slavery without calling it that. The codes dictated that Blacks must have written proof of employment. They were imprisoned for vagrancy as they had not been able to establish homes outside the jurisdictions of the plantations where they had been held. They could get out of prison and work off their time by doing exactly what they had done prior to being emancipated. 3 years after the advent of Black codes, the resurgence of Jim Crow laws again came into play. Jim Crow was a fictitious name coined by a white man performing in blackface during the 1830s and 40s. The combination of Black codes and Jim Crow reinstituted slavery by calling it another name. In 1868, the 14th Amendment made newly freed people citizens. That is, freed slaves were given citizenship, much like those who come to our country now as immigrants seeking citizenship. The 14th Amendment allegedly gave them that. 2 years later, the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. And I just lost my place. Historian Darrell Heller, known to all of us here in South Bend, says that the failure of the government to advance the constitutional edicts and protect the rights of Black people is that for which reparations is most significantly owed, even more so than for the 2.5 centuries that they were held as slaves. Because at the time of Emancipation Proclamation, the country, the government could have decided to do something different. Darrell goes on to say, imagine, if you will, what this country would look like if the 4 million newly freed people would have been given consistent support and autonomy? What if they had been given land, which would have allowed them to begin accumulating wealth to pass on to their children and future generations? What if former slaves had been given time and space to recover in their own way, according to their expressed needs from the generations of trauma that 246 years of slavery had inflicted? What if the 14th and 15th Amendments had actually provided the rights and protections that white people enjoyed? What if newly freed people could have made claims in court and had their cases judged fairly? What if liberty and justice applied to them as well? What if the democratic process, as was practiced as fully for Blacks as for whites, Blacks were made up the majority of the counties in the South? What would Congress have looked like, and what kind of priorities would they have made? What if the 15th Amendment had applied to women, Black as well as white? What if the voices of these women were part of shaping of the national policies over the last 150 years? That's the end of Daryl's quote. Sadly, these things did not go as they might have. Nevertheless, there have been some cases for reparations in the past few years, despite the absence of any law mandating such actions. In March of 2021, Evanston, Illinois, selected the first group of Black residents to receive reparations through the city's restorative housing program. The program will distribute $10 million over 10 years. Each resident who is selected will receive $25,000 in housing benefit to be used for down payments on homes or home repair. In January of 2022, Princeton Seminary stripped a slaveholder's name from its chapel and vowed $27 million in slavery reparations through scholarships and other programs for descendants of slaves and oppressed people. 3 months later, Harvard University set up a $100 million endowment fund for slavery reparations. The report states that Harvard benefited by free slave labor, slave trade, and business dealings with industries linked to slavery. In each of the 3 cases I've just mentioned, acknowledgement of injustices was made and the actions taken toward repairing the harm. There have been other incidents that you can easily just with Googling a search. While it is good to recognize positive actions of the types I've mentioned, it is also true that there is much, much more still to be done. It will take a lot of education and discussion to help people understand the need for reparations. But if we act together, reparations in time can become a reality. I hope that the government will act if citizens are persistent in demanding action that will someday lead to true justice and equality. That is our task, to convince people. The mission statement of the South Bend Reparations Working Group is to advocate for reparations at the local, state, and federal level as a way of acknowledging and repairing the harm caused by historic and current injustices experienced by African American descendants of slavery and its aftermath. Will you join us? Thank you.
Thank you, Nimbi. Do you, did you want to pass this on to Monica at this point? Okay, Monica Tetzlaff, will you unmute yourself and speak?
Yes, thank you so much. And I want to add that learning about Nimbi's life story through her book, There is an Exit, is part of how we remember and understand that after slavery, there's so much also that we have to make up for. I'm going to share the screen if that's possible, because I want to share a PowerPoint that I have. And I'm trying to make this personal as a white person, and why this matters to me. So I'm a descendant of immigrants from Germany and Hungary who were on the wrong side of World War II. And some of the harm that they did by participating in the Nazi Party, my grandparents, has been atoned for by the country of Germany, by reparations and by memorials. What is less known is that people like my family who lost land as a result of World War II and the resulting Cold War were also compensated. So my family received reparations for land that they had lost. And it was actually quite helpful, much like the Evanston reparations and putting a down payment on a building in Chicago. Other things that the nation of Germany has done is compensation to the Jews, but you notice they compensated their own people first. And then they had other compensations for groups like the Roma. What's also important here is how things have been remembered. The reparations have been characterized as pretty miserly, but it's not really the amount that matters. What many Jewish people talk about is that working through the past is what we really need to do. A little bit of what Nimbi has done today and Daryl has done in talking about the history and making public memorials to remember it. And unlike us, where we're being attacked for teaching about slavery in the schools, and there's currently a very hot debate on that, teaching about Auschwitz is required in the national school curriculum. We have paid reparations, so just a little reminder that, of course, the internment of the Japanese was one thing that in the past the US has atoned for with some payments to survivors. And there's a picture of the act being signed, and there is a memorial. What's lesser known is that we've also paid reparations to the Aleuts, and I think that they have been given a disservice in that we don't remember them. They were part of the United States, and they were interned for their protection from Japanese attack, but treated very badly there. And so they were included, but hardly anyone knows about it, which I think is important for us to think about when we think about reparations for the descendants of slaves. Colleges and universities have done reparations, as Nimbi has told us, and my advisor started the project at the College of William and Mary, where I went. They now have a beautiful memorial to those who were enslaved and contributed, and they have conferences and other things. He would have liked to have seen more scholarships for the Black community in Williamsburg. That's been a little bit of a harder sell. I also have been very influenced by understanding how housing has built wealth in this country. And my friend, the historian Tom Segru, contributed to this by writing about race and inequality in the North, so post-slavery. And as Nimbi mentioned, Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Case for Reparations. Another book that's been important in my understanding is one that Ta-Nehisi Coates draws from a lot, and that's called Family Properties, The Struggle Over Race and Real Estate in Chicago. So family owned a building like this in Chicago, which they bought with that reparations down payment. And then they were able to sell it and then buy real estate in Florida. Let me go a little bit forward to showing you that. Okay, so a little place on the beach, a motel that my parents ran, and that never made much money, but it appreciated tremendously in value. Now, Black people in Florida only could live in this area, Gifford, that you see up here on Highway 1. And their land was actually taken by the US government during World War II to make the airport that you see there on the mainland. My area, the island, was a sundown town. So a Black person couldn't have done what we did. And I also saw how the inheritance that I have is based on my white privilege. So let me go back to what some others have talked about. These are historians who look, or actually they're a political scientist and a writer who look at the issue of reparations through history. And this writer, who is a lawyer, I believe, has looked at redlining, which many of you are familiar with. And I just was teaching this yesterday, the 1950s, the building up of wealth during this time when FHA loans and VIA and GI Bill loans were prevalent. Levittown, the really affordable housing that was built then in suburbs, had restrictive covenants. Blacks could not buy this housing, and there was a lot of discrimination right here by the government, which is the argument of the color of law. The GI Bill and FHA loans enabled whites to buy homes in the suburbs. Blacks could not, because when they moved into an area, a red line was put around it and banks would not loan. It was both the private banking industry and government that supported that. And homes have been the greatest source of wealth for working class people as a step to upward mobility. Housing discrimination also occurred in the North through the actions of ordinary people. One example is the Detroit race riot during World War II, when African Americans migrated to get jobs in defense industry during that time. And another is that the open housing movement in cities like Chicago met violent as well as really insidious nonviolent opposition, like putting salt on people's lawns or a snake in the basement, which actually is pretty violent. Individual Black families were threatened and harassed in South Bend. We know this because there was a hearing by the Civil Rights Commission in 1966, and we know it through individual stories. The government is implicated because basically the police didn't do anything when things like this happened, and so it was a tacit approval. Let me go now to South Bend itself and how we've been learning the history of South Bend. As many of you know, Les Lehman started the Civil Rights Heritage Center, and he gave a speech called Dealing with the Fox, Race Relations and Civil Rights in South Bend, where a lot of people from the community attended. It was called the Lundquist Lecture. And he named names and he said exactly which places were segregating here in South Bend. And one of the results of that was he mentored students to write books about that history. And that we created the natatorium, which is one of our memorials of remembrance to that injustice. Further evidence comes from the book by Gabrielle Robinson, Better Homes of South Bend, about how Black working class people who had saved their money had to secretly have houses built in the neighborhood of their choice in order to obtain that American dream of home ownership. And a memorial to the attorneys who helped them, J. Jester Allen, who's in the back row, and his wife, Elizabeth Fletcher Allen, to the far right in the second row from the back, are memorialized today at our county sitting building. There are others that we could listen to on the podcast of the Civil Rights Heritage Center. And there were people that I had the privilege of meeting who told these stories. What is my role? I teach, I research, I write, and at the urging of Nimbi and others, I've joined the South Bend Working Group on reparations. Daryl, of course, is an important part of that. And I'm going to close here with some thoughts on why we should do this. Healing is needed both for the perpetrator and the victim. Reparations are restorative justice that allows the victim group to heal and gain a sense of stability. Rescuers, good people in the perpetrator group are able to apologize for their group, and there are allies that we see in the South Bend history here. Through active listening in small groups of perpetrators and victims with trained facilitators, a community can imagine a shared future together. And that is why I'm so grateful for you, the League of Women Voters, for giving us this opportunity. I'll close with this question from Deb Stanley. Are reparations to repair harm or merely a compensation for harm? So what do victims of harm ask us to do? I think we need to turn again to Nimbi and Daryl and others who are the descendants of the enslaved. What actions might we take as a community to transform our society to prevent harm based on race? Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. I'd like to ask now is GlendaRae, are you teed up to speak here?
I think so.
Okay.
You can all hear me?
Mhm.
Okay. My experience is a little different, but and it kind of jumps around, but anyway, I really appreciate all of that, Nimbi, and oh goodness.
Monica.
Monica, I'm sorry. And Monica has shared with us. So this comes out of, to some extent, comes out of experiences I've had since we came here to South Bend. And I've always been in favor of fair housing. But when we moved here, we chose to move into the southeast side, just below downtown, in a way to say that, well, for one, that we wanted our children to grow up with diversity of people. And then through the experiences here, I have what I would say is a personal experience, not necessarily as Black people would have in this neighborhood, but to a large extent, how the city and other governments looked at us. I'd always been in favor of fair housing. And it wasn't until I recently read the book, and I believe that you showed a picture of that book, that I found that it was really the federal government that was behind the redlining, that they informed cities that they had to draw a red line around the neighborhoods, which would be only areas where Blacks would be allowed to buy or rent. And of course, this led to overcrowding and disinvestment, and people couldn't access money to fix up their homes or any of that. And we observed that right here in this neighborhood. When we came here, we had no um, no, I'm sorry. Okay,
Go ahead.
okay. We had no credit rating because when we were first married back in the 60s, it was like you paid cash or you went without. And so we bought our home on, oh, what do we call it? It's a process where you pay the owner, and it's like paying rent because the house isn't yours until you've paid the last payment.
That was
Land
land contract. Land contract.
Yeah, right. And we discovered that those who were whites dealing with whites had a fairly good experience with this. But we also learned that there were people here in the neighborhood who had faithfully paid their payments and even gave the owners the money to pay the taxes, and then the owner never paid the taxes, and so the house was sold out from under the family that had been paying for it all along. So this is how things got twisted around. And then of course it was the people living in the neighborhood who were being blamed by the society at large for the fact that the houses were running down and nobody was fixing them up. But we can say from our own experience, if you don't have the money and you need to borrow it and it won't be loaned to you, what are you supposed to do? So this is one way that people were treated then when cities could get money from the federal government to improve the neighborhood, but then their idea of improvement was to move everybody out to other areas and do something entirely different, such as more expensive housing or businesses or whatever. In fact, here in Monroe Park, they were going to take every house down, and we as a neighborhood fought for a long time to get that changed. So we ended up with half of the neighborhood being saved north of Bronson Street, and then south of Bronson Street, they turned it into light industrial. And it's interesting also that those first businesses that came in and received their tax abatement and all that, once the tax abatement was done, they took off. So it's a system that's designed, I would say, to keep whites in power and blacks with none. And I just use this as an example of why there is a definite need for reparations in the area of housing. Also, the idea, as has been mentioned, that after Lincoln was assassinated and his vice president, who I had not known before, but turns out it was a Southern person, which I suppose in those days made sense, how you had to balance your ticket and all that. But with the elimination of Lincoln, then this guy had no idea of building any reconciliation or helping those slaves that had been freed. So while a few people were given the 40 acres and a mule, it was snatched back from them and given back to the original owners in the Confederacy. And when the Northern troops were pulled out, then those former Confederate states were allowed to write their own constitutions, their own rules. And of course, they had no intention of allowing those who had been freed to be equal to them. Their mindsets hadn't changed at all. So almost every state, I think Mississippi was the first one, they wrote these black codes, which were laws that pertained only to Black people. And because the 13th Amendment had said that they couldn't be used to work without being paid, they set up all these rules and laws so that they would have to be punished in some way. So they were put in these chain gangs to do the work for free. And the movie 13, which refers to the 13th Amendment, makes very clear how that worked. Well, there were just numerous examples, and what I've been doing over the last few years especially is reading more and more about the whole aspect of history that we were never taught in school. The former slaves were treated and not given an advantage to become equal citizens. And so those patterns that were developed after the Civil War meant that they've just continued, and people have this mindset. When people ask where white superiority comes from, I say it's just breathed in and out as you're growing up. I mean, it's just assumed, and it just perpetuates what's been going on and on and on. So it's going to take a lot of education and a lot of coming together and understanding these aspects of history to know why we need reparations.
Thank you, Glenda. I don't see any questions in the chat. And so if anybody has any questions, if you could quickly do that, or perhaps we can just do them orally. It's just that as far as I can see, there's such a voluminous amount of stuff to talk about here. I don't know how we could finish before 5 o'clock, frankly.
Melanie,
And I want to just, before I do anything else, I want to thank Nimbi and Monica and GlendaRae for all they've contributed today and all they've spoken about and organized to make this an amazing, informative, and moving session today before we do anything else. Thank you. I do see a question here from Elizabeth. She says, what form do you think reparations should take direct cash payments, investments in specific neighborhoods, businesses or communities, or others. Would anybody like to handle that?
Sorry, go ahead. I think that question would be answered differently by almost as many people as you asked of it. But as for our group, South Bend Reparations Working Group, we're not necessarily focused on cash payments. We don't see that as the only end to a means. It's far more complicated than that. Some of the things that have been done, I'm encouraged by the educational community that has come into this conversation. I mentioned Harvard and Princeton, also Georgetown. Georgetown was particularly interesting to me because it's run by Jesuits. And that school had, I think it was around 1827 or so, they sold more than 200 slaves in order to keep from going bankrupt. They have acknowledged that, I think, and they have committed to raising $1 billion towards reparations that will be paid back in the form of scholarships and trust funds, as well as a health care. And they also had a stipulation for emergency care for the elderly Black people. So the Brown University is another one. And I think it's appropriate that we're seeing some of the beginnings of this taking place from institutions of higher learning, because that's where the conversation has to start. I think waiting for our government, our federal government, to do anything more than has been done is futile. It's certainly not going to happen in my lifetime, nor even my grandson, who's 16, nor his will we see it. But incrementally, I believe that by the lead of institutions like the ones mentioned and others, there have been Asheville, North Carolina. It took us 400 years to get to where we are now. So to expect that we're going to repair everything in 50 years is not going to happen. I think what's important is that we see a movement, a mindset that recognize the harms that have been done. And Deborah Stanley said a question. She asked, are reparations to repair harm or merely to compensate for past harm? And I would say that in the best of all possible worlds, both those things would happen. Both repairing of harm that is ongoing right now, as well as paying for in some way, in some form, the harms that were done to Deborah Stanley's ancestors and my ancestors and most every Black or African American in this country. So, okay, I've said enough on that.
Okay, go ahead.
I get worked up and then I lose my train of thought. But I heard recently someone high in politics, I don't think I'm supposed to mention names here, but the statement was made that, and it's been said other places too, we've elected a Black president, so what else is there? You know, how can you say that this country is still racist, having elected a Black president? And to that, I would just name some names here, like Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, Keyshawn Thomas, Jalen Walker, and closer to home right here in South Bend, Dante Cottrell, all killed racist acts against them, all, and all since the time of President Obama. Dante Cottrell here in South Bend was just 4 months ago. So for anyone who is naive enough to believe that racism no longer exists, that's a conversation stopper right there for me, because if you haven't gotten past that, then you can't possibly be open to hear any kind of conversations about reparations for something that none of us here on this Zoom, but we have to account for it. Our history needs to tell the truth about it, and there needs to be an acknowledgement made from the top. That does need to come from the government, I believe. That an all-out apology, this horrendous, heinous, I don't even know what to call it, system that existed,
Cynthia Heckman
that was
said this
allowed to
discussion of
exist.
reparations must also include Native Americans.
And I think I said that at the beginning. If I didn't, I apologize, because it is the belief of this organization that any talk of reparations must first acknowledge the indigenous people who were the first in this country to be annihilated, to be genocide. They were just killed and run over by white supremacists and oppressors of people of color. I do believe I said that at the beginning, but if I did not,
Yeah.
that is
You
absolutely
did.
the belief of South Bend Reparations Working Group. Absolutely, they must come first, but our cause is separate, and it's different because what was done to the Native American is inexcusable and absolutely criminal. The difference being they were here centuries before anyone else got here, but they were not brought over in slave ships
No, you need to.
and chained. I think that is a difference, and the two conversations, I don't think they can certainly coexist, but that they stem from completely different causes, for lack of a better word.
Okay, I'd like to just mention that we are overtime right now. We didn't start until 12:15. So with everybody's approval, I would like to continue until 1:15. And if you have to leave, you can, we're still recording, and you can go to the league website, and I think on Facebook too, and you'll be able to see the recording of this session. We have a couple more questions. Diane has had her hand in the air for a long while there.
Fine. I have a question on the educational front. How could a potential Supreme Court decision limiting or eliminating affirmative action in college admissions possibly affect reparation options in higher education?
Marty, are you online? Marty Wolfson?
She was here.
Monica,
I'm here.
did you
I'm here.
speak to
Yeah.
that question, Marty?
I'm here,
Linda,
but I don't
Linda,
know that I know the
you're
answer.
muted, Linda.
No, it's Marty I was calling on. Marty,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
don't know the answer. I don't
Yeah.
know the answer to that question. I wonder if Marty or Monica might speak to it.
well, I don't know the answer specifically, but I think it would make reparations a lot more difficult. I mean, that's, and the Supreme Court, and the way it's currently constituted, I don't think we would be able to get any kind of progress out of the Supreme Court. This, you know, our task right now is really education. and advocacy, of course, but we need to establish the basis of understanding among the American people for why this is important. And of course, that means, I think, accompanying the demand for reparations with the understanding that at the same time, there's a need to address the deteriorating economic conditions of many white working class people, and that we really need widespread support. And we need to overcome this idea that it's a zero sum. Anything that Black people get is taken away from white people, which does not have to be true at all.
Okay, I see Beth there.
Thank you, Melanie. I just want to be brief and say that there needs to, again, be lots of education. Everyone here can help towards that by spreading this link to everyone they know and encouraging that people just listen. The second thing is the way that housing continues to perpetuate itself, the way that we've heard about how it kind of got to where it is the way the appraisal process for property works. So if you can learn more about how that works and why neighborhoods that are predominantly white neighborhoods have appreciated more than 100% year on year, where neighborhoods that are predominantly people of color have only appreciated 60% in the same time frame, you will know that it's a appraising process that we have to work with for today's problem.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to comment or has a hand in the air? I'm looking in the chat. Linda?
Yeah, I do agree with what Beth said, both things, both about education and also looking at particular problems of how we get and how we stay where we are. And that people have been talking over the past weeks about, we can chew and gum and walk at the same time. Well, we need to integrate those two, to my mind. It's that the education is an ongoing process. And I think probably the people on this group they're involved in that process. We're involved in that process. I'm amazed at how much I don't know and that I can learn. And this has been going on for a lot of years. So that's important. But the other thing is, when people talk about lenses, that you look at every problem, you can recognize a problem, but when you recognize the problem, you look at through a lens that can be distorted or can be more true to the fact. And if you do, then I think we have to speak out and sometimes stand up, and we have to try, even if it's in a small way, to find time to correct it based upon all the things we've been learning. And it's tricky because there's so many, it's a tough time to live and there's a lot going on. But for people just mentioned housing, there's so many problems in housing. I mean, there are places people aren't living. It's not just the people that are on the streets, there are people being evicted every day, 30 to 40 people on the eviction docket now, right? In the last 3 weeks. There's a lot of work to do, and sometimes there's just a piece of it. I can't do certain things anymore. My body won't let me, but I can find pieces of it to do, and then I can connect it with what I'm learning. So that keeps me happier than feeling unhappy.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to get to Elizabeth Benyon, who's had a comment.
Maybe no one still like.
Is Elizabeth on?
Yes,
Elizabeth Benyon?
she is.
Okay,
I'm on, but you can read it from the chat, Melanie.
okay. Well, I just thought that you could just start and go. But anyway, your question was, how do recent immigrants who happen to be Black fit into any plans for reparations? Does any plan to compensate people for past harms require documentation of ancestry? Why or why not?
Just to give a quick answer, because we're running out of time, we don't take up, well, we are for the descendants of the enslaved is what we're specifically looking at in our group. And in that book, From Here to Equality, there's a plan about how that could be documented with the 1870 census, I believe, and maybe some other ways. But so that's one thing that's just specific to our group. Could I answer another question from the chat that I am?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Another question was, what about the neighborhood by Charles Black Center? And I'll share the screen again just for a moment so you can see what they're talking about. This is the neighborhood, and to the left here, that's not a baseball diamond. That is, this is LaSalle Park, Beck's Lake, and it's a super fun site. And they did do some removal of soil here. And then that resulted in a safer place in that area. There has been chemical dumping in that historically Black neighborhood, and then lead in the soil. So they've done some remediation work. Honeywell and the city of South Bend paid for that through the mediation of the EPA and the Superfund. I'm going to be teaching about this next fall and doing some more study this spring. And I'm very interested in Black Lives Matter has asked for some reparations, and there's been other discussions in the community about that particular form of harm that is very specific to our community. And I do think that also someone mentioned lead paint in homes. This housing segregation basically trapped African Americans in older housing that had lead and continues to do so with generation after generation suffering. So, and poor white people would also be very benefited by any programs that help make for a healthier environment in low-income neighborhoods that are historically African American. Thank you.
Would any of the other speakers like to add to anything and make any short comments? We've got like 1 more minute until 1:15.
There is one more question. There is another question. Do you think women, Ellen asked, do you think that women descendants of slaves should get extra reparations of benefits? The universities mentioned exclusion of women from admission for a number of years.
I think universities should consider that.
Absolutely, yes. As in so many cases, women have been left out where they shouldn't have. So I would certainly be a proponent for that happening, that they got additional provisions or consideration. Yes.
Okay, I think we're at the hour mark. And I think maybe other people will have things they need to be doing here. One thing I'd like to say is, if anybody has any ideas on follow-up for this session, I think that this may be a session that that might benefit by follow-up. If you would contact Pam or me or Nimbi and let us know if how you might like to follow up with this in the league. Okay. Nimbi?
I'm just saying goodbye. I thought you were ending.
Oh, okay. All right. So anyway, lastly, thank you all again. This has been very, very, very instructive. And I just can't say anything more except thank you, thank you, thank you.
Welcome and thank you.
Okay.
sold by one pieces, not sold one by one pieces.
Okay, goodbye, everybody.
Whole basket. Okay. The boss tell me, oh, I say okay.